Deathknight Rework. Is it time? Well, Frost DK needs both weapon playstyles to be equalized, while Unholy's over-reliance on externals has destroyed meters for far too long, I tell ya. These issues are not uncommon, and I will tell you what needs to be fixed about the class, while also why we are actually going to get a rework eventually. The class as a whole is missing a shared identity that makes people feel like they are playing a Death Knight. This needs to be addressed from a few angles. First of all, we need the utility to be equalized across the board, and although the actual utility kit is fairly limited, its value cannot be overstated. The best example of this is Death's Grip and Gorfien's Grasp. Right now, Blood reigns supreme in this area with a shorter cooldown on Grip while also being the only spec to be able to use Gorfien's Grasp. Grabbing stuff is not a Blood thematic playstyle, so it shouldn't be limited to just that spec to be efficient, considering the utility it brings to groups. Having all three specs access the Deathknights kit equally will make you feel like you are playing a DK and not a Sunday sale subclass of it. It would also balance out the reason to bring a DK to your group where all three specs have an equal chance to get in. Of course, aside tuning and role availability. But it would be a start. Same thing is with AMZ. When Blood can bring a better version of something, if you need that something, why would you bring an Unholy or Frost? And if you do, it would just feel like we couldn't get a Blood DK, so we settled for Unholy. As an Unholy player, you just feel lackluster for being the oh well, guess you'll do choice for your guild or friends. And this applies to DPS nodes as well in the class tree, because some DPS nodes are so strong and because fundamentally you will never want to pick utility over DPS, and if you do it will feel bad, you are left with little actual choice in terms of survivability, utility, mobility, and so on. I have yet to see a top build for DK that runs Wraithwalk, a core identity spell for DK on a class that is historically very bad at moving from A to B. There are situations for Unholy and Frost where they would like to take Insidious Chill as the class rate debuff that Deathknights bring, but they have to sacrifice Death's Echo, losing out on a charge of Death and Decay and a lot of damage as a byproduct, or maybe Unholy Bond with the same outcome. Leveling should also be addressed by giving the whole class more baseline abilities. This has proven to be helpful with other classes getting baseline stuff like the recent Rogue changes where spells like Sap became baseline. We touched on this in a previous video, but the leveling part of Death Knight is very wonky. The resource functions differently for each spec and is valued vastly differently, making new players feel a little bit at odds when switching from one spec to another, feeling like they learned totally different bad habits. And normally that's fine if the difference wouldn't be this big. Homogenizing a baseline kit, abilities and resources would go a long way to making DK players feel like Death Knights and not the hyper specialized version of what Legion made everyone to be. The good things about Frost is that it retains something very logical in how the capstones define the playstyle, which is more than we can say for Unholy. That being said, even with all the perfection added to the Obliteration build and the constant iterating on Breath of Sindragosa, the spec is incredibly unchanged since, once again, maybe Legion. The playstyle is the exact same. Obliterate to consume runes, Frost Strike to consume runic power, and if you pop Breath of Sindragosa, you don't use Frost Strike anymore. Of course, you have Howling Blast and Remorseless Winter, but it's all the same playstyle. The new tier set will put Chill Streak back on the menu and it will offer a breath of fresh air, probably enough before it becomes too much not to have a rework. The discrepancy of the two weapon styles has to be addressed as well. It has zigzagged back and forth for expansions already, and it's still tedious to loot the wrong weapon since you have very minimal control over it. Breath needs to be changed from the mentality of maintaining it for as long as possible. Although the concept is nice and granted more interesting than pressing a fire and forget button, it just does not function with modern combat design. It didn't work for Shadow Priest back in BFA, it won't work now. Make it more impactful, make it a set duration, or at the very least make it so it won't be tied to your ability to stick to a target as the most immobile melee DPS spec in the game. Yeah, Yeah, I said it. With how much Marcelian and I fought in our wheelchair debate of Ret versus DK, Ret has received almost its entire rotation on a range menu. So it's possible for sure. Make Frost more mobile, give it more range, or remove the insane punishment of not having 100% uptime on your target. A lot of the passive talents and damage amplifiers can be trimmed down to make room for more build variety. Currently, Frost DK is a bit too much entry-level friendly and leaves little room for death and interesting playstyles. The double charge on Empowered Rune Weapon and Rune of Hysteria seem to also cause a lot more issues than they solve, however well-intentioned the design is. Similar to Frost, the talent tree for Unholy has a lot of bland talents that could be combined with other ones or taken out to make room for more interesting things. And although not an actual talent, Festering Wounds is not something that we should manage in 2023. It's essentially a third resource to juggle. For how prevalent it is in your design and how it interacts fundamentally with your rotation, it does way too little damage and feels like busy work to make you forget that it's sharing functionality with Scourge Strike for what should probably be one skill instead of two. That, or of course, rework what wounds are. We came a long way from Shadowlands to Dragonflight, where we seemingly have wounds and disease talents and pet talents. Although the pet identity has been pretty much nailed, the disease still seems a bit awkward. Classes like Hunter, Frost Mage, even Warlock have options to forego the pet for some bonuses, so much so that it feels weird for Unholy not to follow suit. And it would make sense for a disease build. It can also introduce the spec to people who like the Death Knight but dislike the pet aspect of World of Warcraft, which is antiquated to say the least. In terms of trimming down the fat, currently Unholy can go up to something like 11 cooldowns for its rotation. Its setup is ridiculous. Over the years, abilities like Unholy Assault have been iterated upon to make the setup less inconvenient, but in exchange we received two other abilities to squeeze into our rotation. One step forward, two steps back, as the saying goes. It's awesome to know you have so many cooldowns, so many buttons that when you press they actually go boom, until you stop to realize that your pet is a ghoul. Dark Transformation makes it into a bigger ghoul. Apocalypse summons 4 ghouls. Army of the Dead summons a few more. And it ends up being a plate spinning circus act during your rotation as well, with around 7 maintenance buffs to keep your eyes on so you can do big damn. As Taze, one of the theory crafters for Deathknight DPS specs, put it very simply, I'd rather be mid-tier on my own regard than top tier with externals, bottom tier without. The over-reliance on external buffs, augmentation, power infusion, OP mastery trinkets, and so on, seems to be on the radar for 10.2, as the devs are currently in the process of moving damage away from army and gargoyle and stuff like that to other parts of your rotation. So they are at least aware of some of the issues plaguing Unholy, pun intended. Blood shares similar issues to Frost. Its design is just too old. First of all, the playstyle is almost the same as Legion, that being 3 expansions ago, with the addition of playing with Dancing Rune Weapons, cooldown reduction, and uptime. The workings under the hood for Blood as a tank also don't seem to fit the design of WoW's combat. The spec is either turbo meh or broken like crazy. The sheer design of its mitigation seems disconnected to how its defensives are created. Tanks should play around maximizing their damage mitigation to increase survivability, with cooldowns being additions that complement that outcome. Blood, on the other hand, has the two conflicting with each other. Death Strike heals you based on the damage you took in the last 5 seconds. The way you survive and optimize your mitigation as Blood is to bank on runic power, and when you get hit by a big attack, that attack's damage is funneled into the Death Strikes you cast for the next 5 seconds. As a trade-off, Blood DK takes probably the most amount of damage out of all of the tanks. However, your defensives provide damage reduction, and when that damage reduction is applied, you take less damage, obviously, but your Death Strike heals for less, because you took less damage. And you may think, who cares, I took less damage, that's the goal. Other tanks don't actively gimp their own mitigation just to take less damage. Prot Warrior doesn't have a weaker shield block when it presses shield wall. Bear's Iron Fur doesn't give less armor when you have Bark Skin up. Same with the other tanks as well. So, where all the other tanks stack their tankiness with cooldowns and mitigation, Blood slightly trades the power of one for the other. Mathematically, it seems to work out sometimes, but design-wise feels like I'm once again getting the short end of a stick. Bone Storm is and has been delegated as a fun, low-level content talent for years. The trade-off of runic power once again is not justified when runic power dictates your survivability. Other talents like this, consumption comes Mastermind follow suit where they just are essentially dead, while other abilities like Blood Mirror have been taken out because of how strong they are, while other tanks use the same mechanic to an even higher degree. Brewmaster's improved new Zaw makes it so the damage that is purified is translated into the stomp of its celestial, aka the more damage you take, the more you deal back. Basically what Blood Mirror used to do. This is not to knock on Brewmasters. Keep doing what you're doing, kings. It just goes to show how behind Blood and Death Knight as a class is compared to the rest. These changes are just the tip of the iceberg. These issues pushed other classes to have their own reworks, which leads us to believe that Death Knight is not far off. And it's not the only one with reworks in the works. Check this video out where we talk about other classes in the same boat, one of which, Rogue, already received its rework as we are editing this video.